I feel a little bit as though today I'm speaking to the choir. Obviously, the fact that you are all here means that not only you individually and as professionals, but your companies get it. And that's not always the case. And I believe that it is collectively our mission to have an even stronger goal, which is to really spread the message, the gospel, if you like, of the significance of business history in our collective societies and communities. So I'm going to ask you to do something unusual, which is to suspend for a moment your beliefs, your professions, and your current roles, and instead assume that you are a member of the C-suite or a chief executive of your company and considering heritage in that light. To facilitate your transition, I'll give you a personal anecdote. So as it happens, I have a passion for history, and that's well known within our family. So as a consequence, our home has become the repository for virtually all of the material that has been accumulated in our family lines over years. And it is not optimally, but it is preserved at any rate and stored in our basement and attic and wherever space may allow. So it so happens that our daughter will periodically come up to me and say, "Dad," and then for emphasis, "Dad," with her big brown eyes wider still, "you do realize that when you're gone, I'm throwing all this stuff away." Although her expression for stuff is a little bit more colorful than that. So returning, again, suspending your notion that you are archivists and historians, you're now CEOs. And our job is to find a way to engage you in the significance of heritage to your company. So I'd like to turn in that respect to a case illustration of some years ago to protect the innocent. We've gone back to the 1980s on this. And it's the story of a gentleman by the name of Elkanah Watson and John Brown. It so happens that Watson in the 1770s worked for John Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, John Brown was not only a famous but also notorious character. He happened to have been a very prominent slave trader. And as time went on, he got embroiled with disputes with the British and was actually captured by them, and his privateer was absconded. This young man, Watson, who worked for him, actually saved him by a liberating raid, and Brown was eternally grateful to him for it and helped launch his career, which took him to Europe and to London particularly, where this lovely picture was painted by Jonathan Singleton Copley. However, the reason the picture is up on the screen for you to consider is if you notice on the lower corner there's a desk, and on that desk is a document. And in that document are the words John Brown, Esquire. And the reason this is significant years later is that in the 1980s, Fleet Bank of Rhode Island engaged in what in America we would have considered a cross-border, so I'm careful about these since they've been used to peculiar purposes recently, but in a cross-border merger in the United States with North Star Bank. And as it happens, Ephraim Watson became the founder of the State Bank of Albany, which evolved into North Star, and John Brown was none other than the founder of the Providence Bank in 1790. The significance of that was that during this merger, there was tremendous anxiety and agita among the respective communities, and the chief executives of both of those banks were looking for some common ground, something that would cement those two organizations. And through our heritage research, we stumbled upon this discovery that, in point of fact, for over 200 years, these organizations had been linked in a very fundamental way through their respective founders. To me, that is the sort of aha sensation that heritage can bring to communication and marketing, as this discovery was used actively to bring those two organizations together at the time of their merger. I'd like to move on to a very practical, current, if you will, illustration of that phenomenon. Because of accounting quirks in both the United States and internationally, often organizations are not able to represent on their balance sheets the intangible value of their company. However, when they make an acquisition, it gets reflected in the phenomenon of goodwill. So this is a case illustration of a company some years ago that was being acquired, which prior to the announcement of the acquisition was trading at roughly $36 a share, not far from its then book value of $34 a share. In point of fact, this acquisition was struck at $80 a share, the implications of which were that there was $1.6 billion of goodwill associated with this acquisition. In years since this transaction took place, there's been great recognition of brand value globally. And it would be our contention that this notion of intangible value, acquisition goodwill, and goodwill when there aren't acquisitions, in fact, is one of the great reflectors of brand value. And within brand value, there is heritage value. And within heritage value, there is also that raw material of heritage, archival value. I want you to retain that thought for a moment because the implications are significant. Often when we're engaging with clients or prospects in the market, it is fascinating to hear how a client will revert to the notion of tangible book value. That is, they consider the value of their archives in its collector's context. I call it the eBay value of an archive. What it is worth to a collector, or its insurance or replacement value. I would contend that that is an antediluvian conception of heritage value. And instead, we need to associate heritage value directly with the intangible value associated with brand. The reason it's important is that if you go back to the turn of the 19th and 20th century, almost all corporate market values were represented by their then tangible book value. So in that era, companies typically traded around their recognizable accounting book value. And many of the financing techniques in that time reflected that. Those days are gone. Today, the S&P 500, over 2/3, sometimes 3/4 of the market value embedded within it is represented by intangible value. The significance of that to heritage, and specifically to mobilizing resources for archives, is that instead of talking about protecting a potential value of, let's call it $1 million in collector's value, in fact, whatever percentage that may be, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that archival or heritage value is equal to the totality of goodwill or brand value, but even if it were 10% of it, we're talking about an order of magnitude of value that takes it out of being just a function, an operation to protect something that people might, through guilt, acknowledge has some enduring value, to an issue that is center of the plate for the chief executive officer, all of you present here. Sorry, I should have gone to the slide before, but this is essentially the point I was trying to make here about this significant difference between collection value and what I would call the heritage approach associated with the intangible value or brand value of a company. So when we refer to living history, we go way beyond the notion that heritage should be preserved simply for its own sake, even though to me personally, and I'm sure to each of you, that is a sufficient and appealing proposition in its own right. What is incumbent upon all of us is to take that message to the C-suite and impress upon them that the heritage of an organization can play a vitally important role in marketing and communications, but in business development as well, and attach heritage to some of the revenue sources that exist within that company. To many chief executives, and archives and heritage is all about the negativity. It's an expense. It's something, as I say, that they care for more out of guilt than out of enthusiasm, and with some reason, because many archives are relatively inaccessible to their potential user groups. The organization often doesn't have, except through a designated archivist, access to those archives. Content is sometimes difficult to find. User groups have a limited understanding of what the archives program provides and how it can be utilized to advance their particular aspects or part of the business, be it legal, human resources, or otherwise. Importantly, recent content often doesn't get added to the collection. Often there is also minimal integration with other information management activities. And as a consequence, materials in the archives aren't used. And it's not at all clear what an organization should preserve and or discard. So coming back to that technical concept of stuff, I think it's all about how we migrate from the sort of scene that I'm sure many of you have been exposed to of random boxes of content that aren't organized through a process where they are entered into reliable relational databases that can be actively used in the course of a business. In many instances, content appropriately prioritized and digitized after their careful preservation, but then used actively in the course of the business through digital and other medium. I realize this is a busy slide, but it's done with some intent and is not intended to be prescriptive. But one of our findings in our work with clients in the marketplace that there's actually a tremendous propensity to oversave content. And that may sound from an historian's point of view as not such a bad thing. But it would be our contention, and I ask you to reflect back on my basement, that clutter, be it physical or digital, is the enemy of heritage preservation. So one of the first roles of an archivist and an historian is actually to winnow that collection and prune it by considering alternative repositories through, in some instances, deep storage for content with lesser value, deploying artifacts in a systematic way of heritage as art within an organization, and then, yes, also to deaccession through sale, auction, or occasionally even to destroy. The reason for that is that if you don't consider the cost of the footprint of an archive, the probability that the resources will be available to meaningfully make that collection accessible and reusable will be diminished. And we believe that filling those gaps is one of the critical roles that an archival historian can play for an organization. Too often, an archive is about the distant past and not about the contemporary living history of an organization. Deploying techniques such as oral histories, or in our world we refer to a concept of story arcs, gatherings of revealing much of that history which is locked in the heads or the hearts of leaders and employees of an organization, is equally important to the documentary preservation of distant history. Similarly, other techniques such as discovery programs that go out to actively embrace employees and former employees and partners to source material from them that they may have privately collected are great ways to augment a collection and fill in those important gaps that may have emerged over the years. So since we're in a church setting, I would like to now have a brief confession. Years ago, we did an exciting project for a leading investment bank commemorating one of their milestone anniversaries. It was great. I can assure you, we used only the best of words. The significance of it was, however, that while we gave a wonderful commemoration of that important milestone, the residual archive, in my view, was fundamentally handicapped. Why? The archive was largely derived and based from communications and marketing. It was head office anchored. It was the story, frankly, of, and I say that proudly, old white men. It had nothing to do with contemporary relevance. This organization today prides itself in being a global leader in their field. A head office archives gave very little tangible evidence of that globality. Diversity and inclusion are hallmarks of their business practice, not only with their staff, but in the clients that they reach out to. No evidence of that existed in that limited archive. And apart from globality, diversity, inclusion, their most important business line today, which was investment management, was not reflected. The archives were a story of investment banking in the 20th century. I believe it is our duty collectively to address and remedy that shortcoming and ensure that the archival record and that historical narrative is meaningful to today's audience and available to them in formats that they will digest. So for purposes of illustration, I'm inclined to put at the center of that exercise heritage research, which, yes, draws as obviously on that primary resource, which is the corporate archive. But we cannot ignore the secondary resources that provide vitally important information to telling that story. And as I referred to earlier, the need for creating content to augment those archives, which then come back and feed back in to that core, which is the archive of the corporation. All of that with the intended purpose of curating that content into meaningful means of expression to reach the market, stakeholders, and audiences that are important to a company. Here we illustrate how we do it and what we do as a firm and all of you in your enterprises. But we also have to consider why. And for that, in conclusion, I would like to turn to one of our presidents, Harry Truman, who made the comment that there is nothing new in this world except the history that you do not know. Thank you.